Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. I'm on Lawford Road in London, in the Camden Town or Chalk Farm area, not sure what to call it. But behind me is the house where George Orwell lived for a bit when he's middle-aged, towards the end of his life, because he died at the age of 47. So Orwell was born in Motihari, in the state of Bihar, that's in India, in 1903, and his father was a bureaucrat in the opium department. So when Orwell was born, his father was rather old. Incidentally, Orwell's real name was Eric Blair. Orwell's is a nom de plume. So his mother was born in Burma, and she was half French. So Orwell himself is, of course, a quarter French. He had two sisters, one older, one younger. And his father was a distant and frosty character. But when Orwell was a toddler, he and his mother and siblings, they returned to the United Kingdom, and they lived a bit to the west of London. So Orwell was a very bright boy. He went to a prep school called St Cyprian's, where he won a scholarship, and thought it was a good prospect to win a scholarship to a major public school. Anyway, so he loathed St Cyprian's, and he later wrote about it in a acerbic essay entitled "Such Were the Joys." The reference to joy was bitterly ironic. Anyway, he met Cyril Connolly there, a distinguished literary editor and reviewer. Cyril Connolly, who lamented that though he was a fabulous journalist, fabulous reviewer of novels, he could never produce a great novel himself, but he did write Enemies of Promise. So Connolly was 1 year ahead of George Orwell. So Orwell, he came from a sort of middle class family. The other boys were upper middle class, or indeed upper class. And they used to ask him, "Do your people have a car?" As in, meaning your people, meaning your family. He lied and said yes. This being the Edwardian era, when if you had a car, you're very wealthy. So he loathed it. They warned against onanism, that it would cause him to go blind and things like that. He felt the place was hypocritical, bullying. The headmaster was a flagellomaniac. He detested the emphasis on games. Be told you're letting yourself down, that the dining table was poisoned with this meagre food of poor quality. The parents were entitled to spend extra food. It was a money-making operation, so they could scrimp on the cost of feeding the boys. The school was doing well. Bear in mind that Orwell's relatively privileged. Most Edwardian children were worse off than he was. Anyway, he was there when the First World War broke out, and he was surprisingly independent-minded in scorning the whole patriotic euphoria that broke out at the time. He won a scholarship to Wellington College in Berkshire. He went there for precisely 1 term before winning a scholarship to Eton, and he thought that was an upgrade, so he went off there. The Eton scholarship in those days was only in Latin and ancient Greek, so he was very gifted at both languages. And his previous school, St Cyprian's, had never let him forget that he was there as a charity case, and he felt terribly humiliated by that. And so then he went to, and so they were sort of advertising the school on the basis, we have these very clever boys, we're so good at teaching, we can get a King's Scholarship to Eton. So there were 1,200 boys in Eton, 70 of them King's Scholars, the rest were oppidans who had to pay fees. So he'd been driven so hard at St Cyprian's, he was completely disinclined to work, and so he didn't pull the finger out during his 5 years there. But these internal exams were called trials, and obviously a King's Scholar, he should have been near the top of the 200 boys in his year, but he was near the bottom because he made so little effort. But he just read for leisure, English literature. Perhaps I'm telling you a bit too much more about his childhood, producing handwritten literary magazines which were passed around for a few farthings a read. And by this stage, his father had retired from colonial service. His father volunteered for the British Army. He was so old, he was put in charge of some place where he had to organise a distribution of canned food. A rather inglorious contribution to the war, but obviously the war couldn't be fought without it. There was the Officer Training Corps at Eton, as in that was military training. They did a few hours a week, OTC, because the presumption being boys who were that pucker would only ever be an army officer, they'd never be an enlisted man. So Orwell hated it and felt a disdain for this. He made no attempt to conceal his contempt for it. He also felt a disrespect towards the Church of England. So he was caned for things like being generally uppish, for his attitude to life and so on, because the older boys had the authority to cane younger boys. He played the wall game for Eton, which is this sort of scrum beside the wall. So he was very tall. He was in this group called Sixth Form Selectors, and for the academic elite of the school, because he was a King's Scholar, and he was superb at declamations, the special declamation speeches, as it's called, on the 4th of June. Today being the 4th of June, as it happens, King George III's birthday, the school's main day of celebration. He read a speech from the Suicide Club, and a review in the Eton College Chronicle said he spoke with poise. Anyway, so it was time to go down from Eton, and his family budget would not stretch to the fees for Oxford or Cambridge. There were other universities, but he doesn't seem to have considered them. The whole idea had been to win a scholarship to these, which for a King's Scholar would be a relatively simple matter. But he so frittered away his time at Eton that they said that wasn't going to happen. He was being too lackadaisical. You couldn't make up for the 5 years of idleness. Anyway, so what was he going to do to make a living? He decided to apply to the Burma police, because in the colonies, the higher ranks in the police were all occupied by whites, and exclusively. That was the rule. So he applied to get into the Burma police, and he was accepted, passed his exams with flying colours. He was brilliant at French as well. Not that French was spoken in Burma, but that proved his aptitude with languages, his ability to learn Burmese. And he had to prove himself at equitation and so on. So he sailed off to Burma at the age of 19. The First World War was not long over. He was in the Burma police for about 5 years, but he came to think he was serving a filthy cause. He hadn't been very political up to this time. They'd been generally anti-establishment, but he came to despise colonialism, think it was a corrupt and unjust system, and he loathed the openly racialist attitudes of many of the whites there. He had to witness execution one time. There's that renowned essay of his, A Hanging About It. On another occasion, he had to shoot an elephant which had gone wild and killed some animals. But there was no need to kill the elephant by that stage. The elephant was very placid. He said it was harmless as a cow, but he simply shot the animal to not look a fool in front of the huge gleeful crowd which had gathered to see him do it. So he felt he was sort of acting out a part, and it was very false. So he was given a furlough to go back to the British Isles. It was such a long voyage that every few years he got 6 months off. So he got to Paris, got off the ship there rather than carrying on to the UK, and spent time in Paris. He gave up his career, and his family were aghast because he had good prospects there. It was a steady career. There was good income. Burma was a hardship post. It was quite well paid. He could go somewhere in the world, and what on earth was he doing throwing away for nothing? So he worked as a plongeur in Paris hotels. You can read an account of this era in his life down and out in Paris and London. So then he returned to London. He lived as a tramp. He mixed with the sort of flotsam and jetsam of capitalist society. These people were down on their luck, these poor little men of the roads, and staying in spikes, that's like homeless hostels and things like that, and produced a very detailed account of it. So he was attracted to the seamier side of life, and he wanted to know about people who were underprivileged. He wrote more about this in The Road to Wigan Pier, staying with the working poor. So he wanted to make it as a writer. He was a journalist. He briefly worked as a French teacher, even though he had no qualifications beyond school. We were not really into qualifications back then. A-levels and O-levels, GCSEs, none of that existed back then. There were degrees, there was a school certificate, but hardly anyone did it. Schools organised their own exams, no sort of national curriculum. The government didn't really view education as its business. Department of Education had only just been set up. Anyway, he was a shopkeeper briefly near Oxford, and on and on. So he got married, but he never had children, though he did adopt a son later on. Anyway, he was a well-known figure by the late 1930s, publishing novels like Keep the Aspidistra Flying or The Clergyman's Daughter. And the First World War he worked for the BBC, but none of his recordings have survived. The scripts are there, but not the actual sound recordings themselves, which is a terrible pity. I should have mentioned he served in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. He was a member of the Labour Party here, but in Spain he joined PUM, Partido de Obreros Unidas Marxistas. But he was horrified to see that Stalin's secret police were more interested in rooting out Trotskyites than they were actually fighting the so-called fascists. So he'd been wounded in the throat there. He managed to leave Spain before he was culled by Stalin's NKVD. He served in the Home Guard here in the the Second World War rather. So he was quite sickly by the end of the war, and he spent some time on a Scottish island in 1948. That's where he wrote 1984. He'd also written Animal Farm, which is an allegory about the Russian Revolution. So he died in 1950. He had an Anglican funeral. He's buried at Sutton Courtenay near Oxford. I always want to visit his grave. Well, that's about George Orwell. I didn't propose to say too much about him since I made videos about him elsewhere, outside the BBC, where there's that gigantic statue of him, or a house with a plaque to him in what's it called, Portobello Road. There's not a blue plaque like that one. All right, that is just a little bit about George Orwell. So please book online lessons with me in history, politics, English literature, English as a foreign language, religious studies, law, French, and so on, and choose me to translate for you from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German, and Russian. What else? Oh yes, I'm a tour guide in London. Toodaloo.